All right, hi everyone. My name's Emily, and I am an alcoholic. Welcome to the Design for Living Big Book study. We are on page 39, more about alcoholism. Okay. We are at the very top. It says that may be true of certain non-alcoholic people. That may be true of certain non-alcoholic people who, though drink foolishly and heavily at the present time, are able to stop or moderate because their brains and bodies have not been damaged as well as ours were. But the actual potential alcoholic, with hardly an exception, will be absolutely unable to stop drinking on the basis of self-knowledge. This is a point that we wish to emphasize and re-emphasize to smash upon home our alcoholic readers that it has or as it has been revealed to us out of bitter experience. Let us take another illustration. Fred is a partner of a well-known accounting firm. His income is good. He has a fine home, is happily married, and the father of promising children uh, of college age. He has so attractive a personality that he makes friends with everyone. Sorry, I'm letting people in. He is so attractive a personality that he makes friends with everyone. If ever there was a successful businessman, it is Fred. To all to all appearance, he is stable, well balanced, yet he is an alcoholic. We saw we first saw Fred about a year ago in a hospital where he had gone to recover from a bad case of jitters. It was his first experience of this kind, and he was much ashamed of it. Far from admitting he was an alcoholic, he told he told himself to the hos he he came to the hospital to rest his nerves. The doctor intimidated strongly that he might be worse than he realized. For a few days he was depressed about his condition. He made up his mind to quit drinking altogether. It never occurred to him that perhaps he could not do so. In spite of his character and standing, Fred would not believe himself an alcoholic, much less accept a spiritual remedy of his problem. We told we we told him what we knew about alcoholism. He was interested and conceded that he had some of the symptoms, but he was a long way from admitting that he could do nothing about it himself. He was positive that this humiliating experience, plus the knowledge he had acquired, would keep him sober the rest of his life. Self-knowledge would fix this. It. I'm going to stop there just for 1 second, just to recap, because that was a lot. So I like how when I first read this, I had this underlined, are we able to stop or moderate? To me, that's like a question because, I was not able to stop or moderate, for sure, because I just could not just take one or two drinks. Um, and then the sentence after that says their brains and bodies have not been damaged as ours were. A lot of normal people, can just have two or one and, stop drinking and then pay for their bill at the bar or whatever and, walk away. I was never able to really do that. Um, and then here in the italics, it says absolutely unable to stop drinking on the basis of self-knowledge. Yeah, I definitely did not think I could ever stop to begin with, nor did I ever want to, but I also like Fred's, experience here, his story. He was, it all looked very normal at first, but then when he put that first drink in his mouth, and he kept drinking and drinking, and it just got worse for him. As he got some consequences, but not many. And then we think that self-knowledge would fix it on page 40. Um, yeah, he had the experience, the humiliating experience plus the knowledge he had acquired would keep him sober for the rest of his life. Self-knowledge would fix it. You know, we think that the knowledge could fix that, but in all reality, we can never, stop, unless we have that spiritual experience. And, you know, step one for sure, that we're unmanageable and that we are powerless and our lives are unmanageable. Um, I was never able to live that way ever, until I came into these rooms and noticed that my life was 100% unmanageable. And I was powerless for sure, because when I put that first drink in my mouth, I was not able to stop drinking. I put many bottles, in front of me, and I would open one and drink it. And then I'm like, okay, well, maybe I'll drink two and three. And, I just couldn't go without. But yeah, I'll move on from there. Says we heard no more of Fred for a while. One day we were told he was back in the hospital. This time he was quite shaky. He soon indicated he was anxious to see us. The story he told is most instructive, for here was a chap absolutely convinced he had to stop drinking, who had no excuse for drinking, who expedited splendid judgment and determination in all his other concerns, yet was flat on his back nevertheless. Let him tell you about it. I was much impressed with what you fellows said about alcoholism, and I frankly did not believe it would be possible for me to drink again. I rather appreciated your ideas and the subtle insanity which precedes the first drink, but I was confident it could not happen to me after what I had learned. I reasoned I was not as far advanced as most of you fellows, that I had been usually successful in licking my other personal problems, and that I would therefore be successful when you men failed. I felt I had every right to be self confident that it would be only a matter of exercising my willpower and keeping on guard. I like these two paragraphs, especially like the second one where it kept saying I, is I like how he put his situation and in this. And it was, I'm pretty sure it was Bill and Bob that he had visited in the hospital. And he he was desperate when he was in the hospital, and he was finally realizing that he needed help himself, and he, asked for help. And, those two definitely understood, the disease and the powerlessness of the first drink. And, again, it's just the self-knowledge part, where we think we can do it until we can't do it. And, we finally surrender to that. I like the last sentence here. It says, I felt I had every right to be self-confident that it would be only a matter of exercising my willpower and keeping on guard. I have that highlighted in my book because I thought that was important, and that stood out to me when I first read it, for sure. Um, Next paragraph. In this frame of mind, I went about my business, and for a time all was well. I had no trouble refusing drinks, and began to wonder if I had not been making too hard work of a simple matter. One day I went to Washington to present some accounting evidence to a government bureau. I had been out of town before during this particular dry spell, so there was nothing new about that. Physically, I felt fine. Neither did I have any pressing problems or worries. My business came off well. I was pleased and knew my partners would be too. It was the end of a perfect day, not only a cloud on the horizon. I went to my hotel and leisurely dressed for dinner. As I crossed the threshold of the dining room, the thought came to mind that it would be nice to have a couple of cocktails with dinner. That was all, nothing more. I ordered a cocktail in my meal, then I ordered another cocktail. After dinner, I decided to take a walk. When I returned to the hotel, it struck me a highball would be fine before going to bed. So I stepped into the bar and had one. I remember having several more that night and plenty the next morning. I have a shadowy recollection of being in an airplane bound for New York, and of finding a friendly taxicab driver at the landing field instead of my wife. The driver escorted me about for several days. I know little of where I went and what I said and did. Then came the hospital with unbearable mental and physical suffering. Um, I always like the italics because they always point out the important parts in the paragraphs I put next to that alcoholic insanity because the minute we think we can justify our actions with alcohol, we we dig ourselves into it like a deeper hole than we really want to without realizing it. We just can't help ourselves. And then I related to the last sentence or the last two sentences. I know little of where I went or what I said and did. Then came the hospital with unbearable mental and physical suffering. Um, I can definitely relate to that just because I have never remembered what I would do, say, or how I would end up in certain places when I was drinking. I don't remember anything actually for majority of my drinking career. I don't remember much of my childhood growing up for sure. I started drinking when I was 7 and I didn't stop until I was 23. So all of that to me was just like a blur because I don't remember very much. I mean, I remember certain pieces here and there, but mainly it was like the traumatic stuff that I remember. And that's why, I drank was because I wanted to cover up all, the trauma and suppressing all my feelings and stuff. So I think that's the only thing I ever really remember. But, I'm kind of, kind of like that as well with other people. I drink because I don't want to feel anything and I'm numbing out the pain. And then it says, as soon as I regained my ability to think, I went carefully over that evening in Washington. Not only had I been off guard, I had made no fight whatever against the first drink. This time I had not thought of the consequences at all. I had commenced to drink as carelessly as though the cocktails were ginger ale. I now remember what my alcoholic friends had told me, how they prophesied that I had an alcoholic mind, the time and place would come, I would drink. Again, they had said that though I did raise a defense, it would one day give way before some trivial reason for having a drink. Well, just that did happen and more. For what I had learned of alcoholism did not occur to me. I knew from that moment that I had an alcoholic mind. I saw that willpower and self-knowledge would not help, and no strange mental blank spots. I had never been able to understand people who said that a problem had them hopelessly defeated. I knew then it was a crushing blow. I'll just finish this off and then explain it. Two of the members of Alcoholics Anonymous came to see me. They grinned, which I didn't like so much, and then asked me if I thought myself an alcoholic and if I were really licked this time. I had to concede both propositions. They piled me on heaps of evidence to the effect that an alcoholic mentality, such as I had exhibited in Washington, was a hopeless condition. They cited cases of their own experience by the dozen. This process snuffed out the last flicker of conviction that I could do the job myself. Then they outlined the spiritual answer and program of action which 100 of them had followed successfully. Though I had been only a nominal churchman, their proposals were not intellectually hard to swallow. But the program of action, though entirely sensible, was pretty drastic. It meant I could have to throw several lifelong conceptions out of the window. That was not easy. But the moment I made up my mind to go through with the process, I had the curious feeling that my alcoholic condition was relieved, as in fact proved to be. Quite as important with was the discovery that spiritual principles would solve all my problems. I have since brought into a way of living infinitely more satisfying and, as I hope, and I hope, more useful than the life I lived before. My old manner of life was by no means a bad one, but I would not exchange its best moments for the worst I have now. I would have not gone back to it even if I could. Fred's story speaks for itself. We hope it strikes home to thousands like him. We had felt only for the only the first snip of the ringer. Most alcoholics had to be pretty badly mangled before they really commenced to solve their problems. So a couple of things I like on page 41 in the italics says not only had I been off guard, I hadn't made no fight whatever against the first drink. This time I had not only thought of thought of the consequences at all. That just kind of reminds me of that we are defenseless because that he kept ordering cocktails and another cocktail and another cocktail, and then he goes into the taxi cab driver and then he doesn't remember anything. That's just kind of like with me, like I would keep drinking and then I would get in the car and drive and then I would drink some more and then my car would end up in a ditch and I would wonder why. It's kind of like, it's just baffling and that's just kind of how I related to that. And then on page 42, I had learned of alcoholism did not occur to me at all. I knew that from the moment that I had an alcoholic mind. I saw that willpower and self-knowledge would not help in these strange mental blank spots. Right next to that, I have a hopeless state of mind because we're hopeless and we don't know like what we were thinking, but it's just baffling because we keep doing it over and over, and the self-knowledge definitely would not help us because we think that we can control it and we cannot for sure. And then I underlined the hopelessly defeated because we are hopeless and we feel defeated because we just cannot stop drinking, and we keep hitting our fists on the bar thinking, well, why can't we stop? Like we keep justifying everything and, all that stuff. And then on the second paragraph on 42, I have they piled me on heaps of evidence to the effects that an alcoholic mentality, such I had exhibited in Washington, was a hopeless condition. He just he was just probably really shocked that, how did he end up like that? And then he just kept, doing it, and then he realized that those two gentlemen that he encountered in the hospital was right, and he just didn't want to admit it until he ended up back in the hospital again, and then he wanted some help finally. That's just kind of how we are with our alcoholism. It's not until we hit rock bottom or close to it that we realize that we need help, because I definitely did not want help when I was not ready, and then until I was ready, willing and able to accept that, I was an alcoholic and that I was hopeless and I could not manage my own life is when I, got sober, and now I'm able to stay sober today and help other people, realize that, I was there in their position, and now that I'm, recovered, that does not mean that I'm not cured, but I am able to stop today. And I have a program today. I have my tools, my sponsor, the 12 steps, all you guys, whatever. Because I couldn't do it, but we could do it for sure together. And then I have underlined I would have to throw several lifelong conceptions out the window. I had to realize that I had to get rid of my old ideas, because they were not working. Um, I had to find a new way of life to live. I had to give up my drinking, my old friends. I had to not change my environment, but just kind of like move on to like healthier outlets. Not going to the bars, but I instead go to like AA meetings and quarterly, um you know what I'm trying to say, quarterly AA meetings. I go to lots of sober cookouts, all that stuff. So I kind of just changed my environments. I stick around the sober people. I don't hang around people that drink and smoke and, get high and, all that stuff. That's just kind of, it makes sense because it's just so much easier to do that because then that's the person that I want to be. You don't want to hang around people that kind of, want to bring you down and convince you that, oh, let's take the first drink just because. So I like to stick around people that have like minds like me for sure, and it has paid off. So I put myself in those environments. Um, and then quite as important was the discovery that spiritual principles would solve all my problems. And then I have my old manner of life was by no means a bad one, but I would not exchange its best moments for the worst I have now. I would not go back to it even if I could. I definitely um I like that because I don't want to go back to my old life. I was very miserable and I don't remember anything, but now that I'm sober a while now, I actually like to remember things. I like to be around people, that get me and I'm able to change my life for the good. And that's only through God because I was not able to do that. But I also have to remember that it's only a daily reprieve, so it's contingent on my spiritual maintenance. I have to pray every day. I have to get on my knees. I have to go to meetings and share. I have to read this big book and actually share to people and study the 12 traditions and you know learn about service work and sponsoring other people and it's a program of action. It's not just we get sober once, do the steps once and get sober. I have to do this every day. And me and my sponsor, we do a yearly house cleaning. It's not just one fourth and fifth step and we're done. Like new things crop up and the character defects crop up and sometimes they change when I have different things that pop up in inventories and stuff. And so I like how it just reiterates that it is a program of action. We have to keep doing this every day. And then I have most alcoholics have to be pretty badly mangled before they really commence to solve their problems. I had to be pretty badly mangled before I got sober. I was just not willing to get my life together, on my own until, God had to intervene. And then luckily, I had some people outside of, AA that told me that AA existed, and I finally got a sponsor. And, that's kind of where it started there. I got sober. And then this was during the pandemic, but I got sober during the pandemic, and then I hopped on Zoom and found a sponsor through there, and I did the 12 steps. And then, we met every week and we talked about things, and we went through this book and we did other things like the 12 and 12 and all that. And that's just kind of what kept me sober, but also, just a fellowship, because I cannot do this alone for sure. And I like how Bill talks about this multiple times. It's a we program, it's not an I program. All right. Many doctors and psychiatrists agree with our conclusions. One of these men, staff member of a world-renowned hospital, recently made this statement to some of us. What you say about the general hopelessness of the average alcoholic's plight is, in my opinion, correct. As two of as the two of you men whose stories I have heard, there is no doubt in my mind that you are 100% hopeless apart from divine help. Had you offered yourselves as patients at this hospital, I would have not taken you if I had been able to avoid it. People like you are too heartbreaking. Though not a religious person, I have profound respect for this spiritual approach in such cases as yours. For most cases, there is virtually no other solution. Once more, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink. Except in a few rare cases, neither he nor any other human being can provide such a defense. His defense must come from a higher power. Yeah, doctors and psychiatrists have never been able to help us for sure. They like to shove like medicine down our throat and admit us into mental institutions and all that. But now, even rehabs and sober living, is an option today, but that doesn't guarantee that we have long time sobriety. It has to come from spirituality. It's I like how it just reiterates that it's not religion. It's a spiritual program. It's a God of our own conception, and only through a spiritual um approach, we are able to stay sober. um I like that sentence. I have heard there is no doubt in my mind that you are 100% helpless apart from divine help. That's God. We all have to come to the state in our alcoholism that it was God that intervened, whether we believe it's God, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever. It's all about spirituality. It's not one particular religion or anything, because we all come from different backgrounds. And it doesn't matter if we're Catholic, Muslim, whatever, Buddhist, but it's all about the spiritual. um And I always just think it's funny. It says, people like you are too heartbreaking. I always chuckled at that, I mean, but I mean, it's true. I get that, but we're just really sick people and we just need help. People like to look down on us like, oh, well, they're just a person under a bridge and a coat and a brown bag with some beer or tequila or something. But really, we're just really sick people needing help because we don't know how to live normally without booze or alcohol, or I mean drugs, or something like that. But we all just really wanted some help, and we are desperate to find it until we come into the rooms and are desperate enough for that. And then once more, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink. That is true. um that does not solve our problems, but we just can't help it because we are the allergy type. We can't just take one and we're done. um it takes quite a bit of alcohol or drugs in our system to get us all crazy and all that stuff. I put at the very bottom, not some of all, but all of my problems. It's not just some of my problems that God can help me with. It's with all my problems. Um, I don't want to start a new chapter, but we have like 10 minutes, 20 minutes. I guess we'll start. We are in We Agnostics chapter 4 on page 44. In the preceding chapters, you have learned something of alcoholism. We hope we have made the clear distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. If, when you honestly want to, you cannot quit entirely, or if, when drinking, you have little control over the amount you take, you are probably alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience can conquer. Um, I like to think, I've heard this a lot of times in meetings, that this is the qualification of an alcoholic. And then I have two questions that, we can ask our sponsees. Have you been able to quit entirely on your own? And do you have any control over the amount you drink on or in your own willpower? I was never able to do that. And a lot of times when I sponsor other people, I ask the ladies that I sponsor this because this is, you know, part one and two of, step one, just because, the unmanageability and the powerlessness, are we able to quit on our own? And can we control over the amount you drink on our own willpower? And a lot of times, they say no. And I'm like, well, then you're probably an alcoholic. I mean, I'm not going to diagnose them, but, I'm like, you're probably an alcoholic then if you say no, you know, um, because we're not able to do that. Um, but yeah. I have underlined find you cannot quit entirely just because, we're not able to quit and we're just, we go to any length to not get sober, and then when we get sober we find any length to get sober. So um yeah, that's what I got from that. And then I like how it just reiterates the spiritual experience because it talks about that a lot in the first 80 pages. So yeah. To one who feels he is a atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible, but to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. But it isn't so difficult. About half our original fellowship were of exactly that type. At first, some of us tried to avoid the situation, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. Perhaps it is going to be that way with you. But cheer up, something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics. Our experience shows you need not be disconcerted. Um, yeah, I like that it says especially if he's an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. We are hopeless for sure, and to be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis is not always easy alternatives to face. I just like that it says death or to live on a spiritual basis. We have two options. It's either death or we live, and to be able to live, we have to live by these 12 steps and the principles, of AA and do what our sponsors say, because if we're not willing, then we're just gonna go back out and then we may or may not make it back in. Um, that's been my experience, and I've seen people, relapse and they don't make it back in. I just recently had someone from another group that I attend to, and he went back out and then he relapsed and he died because he didn't make it back in because he drank too much and it was alcohol poisoning. So it's a good reminder that this is why we don't pick up a drink or a drug again because we may not make it back in. Um, so, and then, but after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. Yeah. Again, like I said in the past, we had to find a God of our own understanding. Because, our self-knowledge, failed us, and we think that we can stop. But in reality, how many times have we tried and we just couldn't until God or AA has intervened, or, the court system has, told us that we need to come in and we're court ordered, or something like that. But, it's just through God and our willingness and being receptive that we are able to, you know, be successful in recovering and sobriety. All right, I think I'll do one more paragraph and then I'll open it up. We're on the bottom of page 44. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We wished to be moral, we could not wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed us utterly. They failed utterly. Um, yeah, I like the last sentence I have highlighted. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. Yeah, that's like living on our own, human willpower. If we're just not able to be successful in any way, we can't, you know, have any type of long sobriety, if we keep living the way that we want to and not having some type of, program or structure or, any kind of spiritual guidance, for sure, because, we just like to do our own thing and, we like to go go by our own rules and we just don't like to be told what to do, but we have to at this point because, we're hopeless and we just cannot stop. We are just so obsessed with doing, whatever we want. And that's not how God would want us to be. He would want us to be happy, joyous, and free. And if we're not, then we're, miserable, down in the dumps, and we're doing reckless and stupid things. So yeah, I like this chapter as well because it just talks about the different type of alcoholics, becoming agnostic or atheist or whatever, and they come to a conception of a higher power to, rely on and understand. And so that's when we start praying and meditating. And yeah, so I think I will stop the recording and then I will open it up. I think that's all I have for today.